In this video, I'm going to show you what happened in the final round of the Sigeman Cup and what a dramatic finish to the event it turned out to be. So let's just remind ourselves of the standings going into the final round. So it's a short tournament, an 8-player all-play-all. So in the lead, we've got Arjun Erigaisi on 4.5 out of 6. Then Jarlskan Erdogmus and Magnus Carlsen on 4 points. So Carlsen has hauled himself back in contention. And final round pairings, absolutely crucial. Erigaisi faced the 16-year-old prodigy from the States, Andy Woodward. And Carlsen faced Erdogmus, 14 years old. So it's an interesting dynamic. So if Erigaisi could defeat Woodward, then he would win the tournament outright. A draw would also be pretty good. And Carlsen, well, his first ever classical game against Erdogmus. So really interesting to see this pairing. As you can see, I've escaped my office and I'm actually on the Greek island of Kos at the latest ACO event. And well, it's an absolutely splendid place to be. And it's great to see so many supporters of the channel here as well. So, well, if you're interested in these ACO events, then do check out their website. The next event takes place in October on Crete. Anyway, let's crack on and take a look at these two final games. Erigaisi absolutely went for it in this game. He just doesn't know how to sort of put the brakes on. And Andy Woodward defended brilliantly. And by the time they'd reached the time control, this is actually after the position after 43 moves. In fact, Andy Woodward doing very well with black. And he found a very neat way to simplify in this position. Queen c1 check. So that forces an exchange of queens. So they reach a knight versus bishop endgame. Now this pawn can be kept under control by the king, and then once black has stabilized, then these pawns will start to push down the board. And white's bishop, not very good either, blocked by those pawns. Now, white's only chance here is to make a quick dash towards the a-pawn. And now the h-pawn advances. This is already a critical position. It's absolutely fascinating. I mean, to my eyes, it looks like black is winning very, very easily. And presumably Andy thought the same. And he played here h4. This natural move turned out to be a mistake. Look what happened. King takes pawn. Now that's an important move. The king came back. Now the knight came in to support the h-pawn. But in fact, it's not possible to make progress in this position. And here they agree to draw, basically. The king is just going to run over and get to the h-pawn. Really curious how white's king made this really long journey and then just came back again. Woodward must have just overlooked something. Or didn't realize how easy it was for the king to come back. Let me just go back a couple of moves. I mean, it's possible to play the knight to another square, knight e2, and then advance the h-pawn. Now, black is going to win the bishop, but if you do this, in fact, white wins because the knight is trapped. The king is back just in time. And you just move in and take the knight, and white is winning. Okay, so how could Black win this position? Let's go back. Doesn't feel like it, but this is actually the critical moment in the game. Or at least this endgame. I mean, there were so many critical moments in the game, it was absolutely wild. So the winning idea is king d6, and after king takes pawn, king c5. And this shuts out White's king just for a moment, gains a move basically. So for example, if the king tries to make the return journey, as in the game, then Black has gained a tempo. Okay, let's just follow it through. And this time, you can see that the knight will emerge, and that's an easy win for Black. After this, and king c5, well, you could try something else. Let's say king b7. Okay, you've got to watch out that the king doesn't play here to support the d pawn. But actually, after knight b5, this is absolutely fine. So White's king has been kept under control. And let's say king d6. Now the knight comes around again. And yeah, this is just too slow. Pawn goes through. So very unfortunate for Andy Woodward, who up to that moment had played a pretty good game. It was an extremely difficult game, but he didn't quite manage to finish it off. Tricky. Okay, so that meant that Erigaisi, with a draw, was ahead by 1 point. So it meant that if Magnus Carlsen could beat Erdogmus, then he would win the tournament. Likewise, if Erdogmus could defeat Magnus Carlsen, he would join Erigaisi at the top of the tournament table. Okay, let's take a look at that game. If I can find it. Hang on 1 second. Here we go. Now, Carlsen decided to take Erdogmus into an endgame. And yeah, well, Magnus was doing Magnus-type things, squeezing away in this endgame. And you can see that he has, well, let's say a symbolic advantage because these pawns are split. But there aren't many pawns left on the board. This knight is very well stationed in the middle. And Black is pretty solid. Now, if White's king can break through, that's another matter. But actually, because this knight is here, it's very difficult to do that. Carlsen played knight e4. Now, it is possible for Black basically to wait in this position. But Erdogmus, I think understandably, he wanted clarity. And he saw a very clear defensive strategy. He decided to give up his bishop. Well, you might say that's a concession, but actually let's see what he has in mind. Now, if the king can break through to the h-pawn, then of course that would be very good, but here's the idea. Knight f7. Now, of course, if king f5, then knight d6 check, and the king would just have to go back. So bishop d5, and now knight d6. Now we can see what Erdogmus is up to. The knight controls the entry square on f5. The pawn on f6 controls e5 and g5. And on the other side of the board, these squares are controlled by the b6 pawn and the knight on d6. So basically, Erdogmus is blocking out White's king. Now, for those of you who are followers of the channel, you might recognize this kind of defensive idea. Can you remember the game Pragyanananda against Mishra from the Grand Swiss last September? Let me just remind you. So let me find this game. There we go. Very similar formation, and Mishra had actually sacrificed a pawn to get to this position where you can see the pawns and the knight, they complement each other, the knight controlling the light squares, pawns covering the dark squares, and basically Prague's king could not break through, and this ended in a draw. And, well, I might have mentioned this at the time. The first time I saw this defensive idea was actually in the game, this game, between Walter Brown and Tigran Petrosian, played it in the Interzonal in 1982, where Petrosian gave up a pawn again to reach this defensive formation, blocking out White's king, and Walter Brown could make no progress. So it's a very, very useful idea. Now, there is a little difference here. In fact, this pawn on d4 makes it even more difficult for White to break through, because White cannot use the d file to get to d5, which could be a breakthrough square. So let's just compare this with Carlsen against Erdogmus. If I can just get back to the correct position. There we are. So that's the position. So you can see that if there were a pawn on d4, this would be a draw straight away, actually, because it would be impossible for White's king to move through. In this case, there's a bit of hope for Carlsen. If he manages to bring the king to d5, then the Black's king could be forced away from d7, and you could break through either on c6 or e6. But still, this is a very good idea from Erdogmus, and, well, let's bear in mind that difference and see how it pans out. So Carlsen played a4. Well, getting a bit of space on the queen side could be useful. And then Erdogmus played king d7, so he's just waiting. Now he brought the knight back to c8. So the reason for this is that he wants to cover the d5 square. So again, if king f5, then knight e7, and the king has to go back. So Carlsen played knight e4, king e4, then knight e7. Right. So the knight is redeployed from d6, but you can see it still covers f5, so there's no breakthrough on the king side. And crucially, the knight covers d5. So again, it's a complete blockade. But there are still a few ways for White to make progress. And this is an interesting moment because Erdogmus, running a little bit shorter time, we're at move 44 here, didn't quite trust his defensive blockade, and he decided to break out with f5. Okay, I'll return to this position. But he could have waited with king d6. But okay, let's see what happened in the game. But yeah, I think f5 is a sign of nervousness. He doesn't quite believe that he could actually keep the king out. So the game went g5. Now this is getting serious. It should still be a draw, actually. And now the king came in. So that king is heading for the a7 pawn. Knight e6, g6, and here is where Erdogmus made a fatal mistake. He can actually still draw with f4, but it's very, very tight. But he played king e7. King came in. Now that black f-pawn looks very scary. If f2, then in fact the bishop just covers. And b5 was played. It's an interesting idea. So, if that's taken, then the pawn would advance. So Carlsen played g7, giving up that g-pawn. But this is now winning. yeah, in these positions where the bishop is such a strong long-range piece, then it's absolutely hopeless. So b5 is, I mean, you could just win the knight, but yeah, b5 followed by b8 queen. And yeah, Erdogmus resigned in that position. He was understandably very, very upset afterwards. He came so close to a draw. Well, let's go back and see where he could have drawn. Well, first of all, in this position, this is the final moment, he could have played f4 and played like this. I mean, black has to play so precisely now. To my eyes, it looks still very, very dangerous. So, yeah, if king f8 is the best, I mean, it's a scary move. But in fact, after king f6, you can check the king away. And yeah, it should be a draw, and so on. But I mean, you know, white could try other stuff there. So we're getting to the point of where black has to play absolutely precisely. But let me come right back to this moment. So this is where Erdogmus broke out with f5, so he couldn't stand waiting. So what happens if he waits? King d6. In fact, it's quite tricky. So the king breaks through to a6. Black's king has to come back to cover. And now a5. So this forces an exchange. And the problem is that once that b pawn disappears, then there's another square that white can use. So you can see black has to cover all these squares. Now, it should still be a draw, but again, this is very tricky. You know, white always has tempo moves with the bishop. Black has to get it absolutely right. Yeah, king d7. Black is still holding, but this is really scary. And it's quite possible to go wrong in these kind of positions. Should still be a draw. But let me go back again. Because the clearest in this position is to play a5. Not king d7 as Erdogmus played, but a5. So what that means is that Carlsen won't be able to play a5 to, you know, give white's king another square. And that's a lot clearer. And in fact, you know, this defensive formation really stands up, and that should be a draw. Yeah, just preventing white's pawns expanding on the queen side. So for example, king here, knight back, knight e7. So this is a nice redeployment. So the knight covers those crucial squares. And if the king comes round, then this is more stable. So if the king comes back, then knight e7. Okay, you can keep going around here. The thing is, if white exchanges pawns with b4 and then a5 to give the king more room, then, well, exchanging all the pawns off on the queen side is inevitably going to lead to a draw. So the clearest move to draw this endgame is a5. And in fact, you know, the way that Erdogmus set up is absolutely sound. As I said, you know, there are precedents for defending like this in a completely passive way, but it should work. So let's take a look at the standings after the 7 rounds. So at the top, Magnus Carlsen and Arjun Erigaisi on 5 points, and then Abdusatorov and Erdogmus on 4. Fanforis 3.5, Andy Woodward 3, Zhu Jiner 2, Niels Grondelius 1.5. Well, Carlsen, I think, shook off the rust after the first few rounds and played his way back into form. Good tournament from Arjun Erigaisi. He almost clinched it, and well, I think for the young players, Erdogmus, he came so close to the top. You know what a talent he is, and likewise Andy Woodward. So Carlsen and Erigaisi joint first. In fact, they had a kind of blitz playoff, which I'm not going to cover it because it was just a bit mad. Carlsen won the first game, Erigaisi won the second, and then Carlsen won the decider. So yeah, Carlsen still has that unbelievable will to win that kind of pulls him through. So it's going to be very interesting to see how he gets on in Norway Chess, which starts at the end of May. Hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for watching.